Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome to Boswell Virtual Event Series. We are so honored to welcome back for the first time in 8 years, Natalie Bakopoulos, the author of Scorpionfish. Her book has won raves from many people, including Jasmine Ward, who said Scorpionfish dazzles, fierce and tender in turn, savor it, and it will leave you changed. Tonight she is in conversation with the wonderful writer and professor Valerie Laken of UWM. We're so glad to have them both here virtually. Please give them a big hand. Thank you very much.
I'm so happy to see Natalie. Natalie and I went to, well, we weren't in the same years of grad school together, but Natalie was a couple of years after me. And so I was still in town in Ann Arbor. And so we've known each other for a long time. And I've been a huge fan of her work for a long time. Loved her first book, loved this book. As I was saying to, well, everybody really, it's just one of those books that it's a pleasure to read, and you feel like you get all the joys of traveling to another country, and you have this sort of romance and all this stuff, but at the same time, it's an incredibly smart book that bears like really, really thorough kind of reflection and analysis. It's so intelligently put together and has so much to say about the world of art and politics and our current social issues in the world, especially with respect to exile and migration. So I'm super excited to talk with Natalie tonight. And I think the format goes that we ask Natalie if you would tell us a little bit about the book, because a lot of people probably haven't read it yet. So if you could kind of give maybe an overview of the book and tell us about, if you want to tell us about writing it or anything else you want to say, and then then read from it just for a short while to give us a sense of it. And then I have a lot of questions I want to ask you, and we can open the floor to questions from everybody else as well.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you and to see you again. And thank you, Daniel and Boswell's bookstore for having me again. And thank you all for coming. So I'll talk a little bit about the book, just kind of a quick summary sort of, and then maybe we can talk more about the writing as we go on into it, or what I was thinking of when I was writing it. So Scorpionfish is set in present day Athens. There are two narrators. The primary narrator is named Mira, and she's a Greek American who was born in Athens and moved to Chicago with her parents when she was 5. But spent a lot of time going back and forth between places. She has, at the beginning of the book, she comes back to Greece after her parents have both died, and she's hoping to reunite with her kind of on-again, off-again boyfriend named Aris. And right when she gets there, they break up. He breaks up with her. He's already in another relationship. And so she's left kind of untethered in a city that she knows and loves, but also has defined by her parents, by her boyfriend. And so she's kind of newly untethered there. Her neighbor, and they share a balcony, and in Athens apartments, many of the balconies are right next to each other, but there's a very thin, often opaque wall that separates them, and often they're over a courtyard or over the street. And these two apartments face a courtyard, and Mira is sitting on one of them, and her neighbor, the captain, and she only knows him by the name, the captain, as she calls him. He's a ship captain who's been recently let go from his post at sea, and so he's at home a lot. And so they're both kind of at home a lot, sitting on their balconies. And eventually they start talking to one another, but they don't see each other. And so they're having these conversations without actually looking at each other. And that's kind of what I was thinking about as the structure of the book. There's a dual narrative with an audience of each other, but also kind of an implied audience, because if you know Greek apartments, everyone's listening to everybody else all the time and kind of aware of other people's business, even if they try to act like they're not. And so that's kind of what I was thinking about for the structure of the book. And so the story begins with Mira arriving back in Athens. Her parents have died a few months before, and I'll just start I'll read a page or two from the opening. And so it doesn't need much more explanation, and then we can talk more about it after. Okay, so chapter 1. Mira. The small 2-bedroom flat where I lived until I was 5 is on the northern slope of Mount Likavitos, between the neighborhoods of Ambelokipi and Neapoli. Back in Athens for the first time since my parents' funeral a few months earlier, my arrival felt both unreal and more real than anything I might have imagined, as though my porous, jet-lagged self had emptied itself into this space. Aris was working in Brussels for the week, And though I still could have gone straight to his place, I didn't. Though I'd planned to live with him, I had to spend some time cleaning out my parents' flat before I'd rent it out. When I'd come for the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to go near it. I expected Aris to object to all this, but instead he'd only asked, "You sure you want to be alone there?" I told him I'd be fine, but really, I wasn't sure. In fact, it had been so long since I'd been to this apartment that when the cab driver hoisted my bags out of the trunk, he must have noticed my disorientation because he asked, "Is this the right place?" I told him yes, but hesitantly. Then I recognized the flat on the ground floor, which, as when I was a child, had its shutters open to the street. You could have jumped right in from the sidewalk. I held my jumble of keys like a lantern. It was growing dark, and for whatever reason, crisis, negligence, all the street lights were out. The key to the apartment itself, a big old-style safety key, was obvious, but I couldn't seem to locate the one for the building door. The others were for Aris's place, the house on the island, and who knows where else. A light went on inside, and a tall man, perhaps in his early 50s, wearing headphones and running clothes, came down the staircase. He opened the door for me. I thanked him, acting as if my hands were simply full. Noticing he helped me haul my suitcase up the first few stairs from the foyer to the elevator on the first floor. Even now, I remember the soapy smell of the rhododendrons by the mailboxes, the hint of his grapefruit cologne. I followed him, then stopped at the foot of the marble stairs. He, whom I'd later know as the captain, placed my bags in the elevator and asked me which floor. I told him the third, and a look of surprise crossed his face. "Oh," he said, "we're neighbors." How had he seen me upon this initial meeting? How had I seen him? I struggled to remember how many of these details I had truly noticed or have simply inserted now. We must have spoken in Greek, though later we'd use English as well. Did I hear the thin music from his headphones? I recall something I had until now forgotten. In that first interaction, I felt a flash of recognition, of some silent acknowledgement, a feeling of both surprise and inevitability. That's it. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Natalie. Thank you. Um, I, I, I'm super excited to talk about this book. I'm sorry, I have to compose myself a little bit. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how, like, what was the first kernel? Because I've been talking in these early weeks of the semester with some of my undergrads about like the seeds of a story or the seeds of a book. And sometimes it's really interesting to me how like the original idea for a book morphs and changes, or even sometimes disappears, gets eaten by other ideas, and the book becomes something else entirely. I was just wondering if you recall kind of like, what was the first idea for this book? Was it that setup of the two people talking on their balconies, or was it something else?
Yeah, I wish I knew for sure, but there's 3 or 4 things that I think were kind of the beginning seeds, kind of all planted all over the place. The first one was one of the first ones was definitely the balconies. And when I had spent a semester in Athens in 2015, and I lived in basically the kind of apartment that Mira lives in and the captain live in. And I was always so aware of what was going on in the apartment. And you know, at 8 o'clock at night, there was a French guy below me who always had a Skype conversation on his balcony. And across the way, there was a woman always putting her laundry out. And she always wanted to know what was going on in the balcony above, because they were always moving things around. And she'd point up there and ask for a report from me. When I'd hang out my underwear to dry, she'd, you know, like give me a little shimmy, like she was aware of what I was hanging out there. And so that balcony, I just kept thinking about that kind of public private space. That was one of them. The second thing was there's these poems by the Greek poet Odysseus Elitis called the Maria Nepheli poems, and they're from the point of view of 2 speakers. One is a young woman about 18 or 19 named Maria Nepheli, and the other is the poet or the speaker. And they're in these conversations back and forth. And I always really loved those poems, even though I sometimes found the way that he portrayed how he would imagine an 18-year-old girl to be kind of a little sentimental, or I always joke like the manic pixie dream girl version in the poem or something. But I do really love those poems, and I love the structure of the call response. And so I was thinking about 2 people talking, the idea of a call response, which is something that's also used in like the Greek ritual of lament, like a woman mourning a death calls something out and people respond to her. And so I was thinking a lot about that. And then the last thing was the semester, or a year before that, I had spent a semester teaching at Semester at Sea, which is a floating university that basically goes around the world with 600 students, 40 faculty, 100 staff. And I was really nervous to go, but once I was out there, I loved the feeling of being just out at sea in the middle of the Pacific. And one time in particular, I went out onto my balcony from my little room, and I saw at the front of the ship, the captain standing out there, captain of the ship just standing out there, just kind of looking out at everything. And I just was thinking, what would it be like to have this kind of life, that this is your job to captain a ship? And then what would that be like in a situation where the Aegean in particular has become very fraught with people trying to cross to safety and crossing for better lives? And also just what would happen if you left that life behind as a captain? And so I started, all these characters kind of started bubbling up and kind of coming into then I realized that those two characters were in conversation, Mira and the captain, and they lived next door to one another. And so those were I think the beginning seeds, or at least some of them. There's more, and maybe I'll talk about them later, but we'll start with those.
Yeah, that's great. How, I have so many questions. I love, you just touched on like my first 5 questions, and now I'm torn about which one to ask you first. But
okay, we'll go through all of them.
There's time. But so what do you, let's start with this one. Like almost every, because you were talking a lot about people being in between and out to sea, and there's a lot of people in limbo, people in between spaces, in between countries in this book, and that's obviously one of the key themes going through it. So let's talk about that first. Like almost every character is a kind of dual citizen or lives kind of split between 2 or even more countries. And there's this great line that Mira says of her parents who were immigrants from Greece to the US and then, kept a place in Greece and sometimes went back or spent some time in both countries. And she says of her parents, their dual identities were clear. When in Greece, they saw things through American eyes, and when in America, through Greek eyes. My father flourished like this. He loved it. He fed off it. He became a larger version of himself. But my mother, I think it slowly killed her. She was displaced in Chicago, and when she was back in Greece, she felt a more acute, sad kind of displacement. She didn't exist fully formed in either place, and she slowly melted away. That passage just kills me because the mother, in so many ways, Mira has all this understandable tension with her mother, and that to me is this really beautiful little kind of crystallization of where her mother's troubles and deeper sadness might reside. And I think that like I'm one of those people who has I have a lot of wanderlust. I've lived in other countries and I love living in other countries. And I honestly never thought I would come back and live in the US. So for me, this idea of being a dual citizen is a big fantasy. And, I think that the dream is that we can have double the fun, like 2 homes, 2 lives, 2 languages, 2 sets of friends, and the freedom to move between them without great cost. And that there will just be a bigger person, with 2 lives. But I think the risk, is that like we might have just a split identity and end up somehow less than whole, always kind of in search of some missing part, that we can't really combine the 2 lives, that they split us in some way. And I feel like that passage really kind of captures that. I was wondering, do you feel like that paradox between, being able to have 2 lives, a bigger life versus losing something critical and maybe having less than 1 full life? Like, in what way does that paradox kind of animate the different characters in the book?
Oh, that's a great question, Val. I mean, I was thinking a lot about the idea of when you have that kind of dual identity, you're always in one place, aware of the other at the same time. And I think for some people, they can be present in whatever space they're in, and for others they're always thinking of the other. And I think for the mother in the book, Mira's mother felt lonely, and the American way of living to her felt very lonely, and the States felt very lonely, even though she had a Greek community there. But she didn't really find the kind of community she was looking for. She didn't really find kind of community in the Greek Orthodox Church, which tends to be the place where a lot of Greek Americans gather. And so I think she was always kind of feeling, at least the way I imagine her feeling, that it wasn't ever enough. She never really found her space. And also the way I think of that generation of women also kind of went along with what their husbands wanted. And he was coming to the States for, I think that fell out of the book why, but for work or for like graduate school and then work. And then she followed along. And so she didn't have much to say about it. And so I was thinking about what the father flourished because that's what he wanted, and he wanted to go, and she never really wanted to go. And so then once her daughter starts going back all the time and has a Greek boyfriend and sees her life there, she resented it in a way because she had more freedom, even if she wouldn't be able to articulate that herself. And so I was thinking a lot about those things. I think for me, the tension of being in two places or wanting to be in both places or having, an academic job here and a home in Ann Arbor and family here and then mixing that with going back and forth to Athens, that kind of tension, I think, is part of my writing, and that back and forth is actually part of how I grew into my identity as a writer. So I wouldn't be able to, I always say I want to just live in Greece full time and that's it. I'm not sure how I would do that, for one. And second, I don't know. I think something about the way that return each year shapes me is part of kind of my identity in itself. So eventually maybe I would be able to be there. But right now that dual identity, I think, provides an interesting tension that for me is where my imagination kind of flourishes.
Yeah, it's funny how I'm often teaching my students about fiction as the art of transgression, about how, stories happen when characters cross boundaries or make, break a rule that they normally keep, and then they have to pay the consequences or deal with what follows. And it struck me that, like, if you have you have a lot of characters in this book who are very, very free. They seem to be very free, like, because there's something about operating in a liminal space where all bets are off. You don't have to abide by this culture's rules or that culture's rules because you're in between them, and you don't have to have full loyalty to either one.
Yeah.
Or also a number of these characters are artists and writers who just kind of don't care what the world thinks of them. They just want to live their own lives. And what I enjoyed was, we see a number of the characters like Natalie, the artist, kind of just gradually break more and more rules, and it's a joy to see. But it's like she doesn't care. She doesn't really pay any consequences for them, and the characters have an awful lot of freedom, even when it comes to their family relationships. Like, a lot of the romantic relationships are relatively open. The characters have a lot of autonomy and freedom, and there's not much judgment of that. There's like a lot of, I really enjoyed that aspect of the book, just the kind of freedom of these characters in the summertime, in between spaces, to do a lot of things that a lot of people in, like, I don't know, kind of like ordinary conventional American culture might sort of raise their eyebrows about. So that's one of the joys of the book. But it struck me too that, like, as a writer, that also poses real challenges in how do you craft a story if the characters are so unconstrained. Like, there's you know what I mean? Like, there's not a lot of consequences for them breaking certain rules. Did you feel that? Did you feel the challenge of that as you were writing the book, or did you just sort of relish in letting them do a lot of things that, that some readers might be afraid to do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a little bit of both. I mean, I think I always am drawn to characters and maybe people who are a little bit outside of the narratives that have been imposed on them by, socially sanctioned structures and things like that. So I think I'm drawn to that in fiction. And I was thinking of a society, especially something like Athens, where there is kind of a streak of social conservatism. I mean, there is here too, absolutely. And I was thinking about, I wanted to create in this character Natalie, and Natalie is a good friend of Mira. She's a generation above her, and she was the lover of Mira's late aunt, and they're still really good friends. I wanted to kind of think of a woman who sort of made her way in the world on her own terms, but was still not immune to the oppression of that world. And so I think Natalie was kind of that character to me. Natalie had come from, she was actually a character in my first novel, The Green Shore, a very minor character who was an 18-year-old girl in one of the prison camps. And she was an artist in a prison camp, exiled during the junta. She never left my mind. And I kept thinking of what would that generation, how would that generation see a younger generation protesting, or a younger generation thinking about art or thinking about identity? And I think younger generations, I think whether it's Gen X or millennials or what's the next after Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, boomers, zoomers, we are more interested in defining identity, where I think her generation was more interested in a bit more fluidity and a bit more ambiguity, and didn't want things to be so defined, where there's a power in defining them, but there's also, I think she may have seen it as something like she wanted that kind of ambiguity. And so I was thinking about what would a character like her, who's gay, who's an artist, who's felt sort of kind of beaten down by social conservatism and the way that her way in the world, how would she kind of be at this point in her life in Athens, a city that she loves, but that makes her crazy? And so I was thinking of those things. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did, yes. Okay. Yes. I was wondering, like, could you talk a little bit more about how, in the context of that, like embracing openness and fluidity and kind of shucking off the constraints of sort of conservative or social constraints, how did you capture, in a way the author then has to define not just each character's personality or identity, but also each character's values, because they're not just all embracing one universal set of social values within their community. They all come from different communities and keep moving between them. And so each character kind of we have to discover what each character's moral constraints are, one by one, on the fly. And so, for instance, I'm thinking of, like, with Natalie, there's that great line where she's not just a vegetarian, she refuses to sit at a table where anybody's eating meat, right? And I'm like, okay, now I understand what her values are. But, like, so you had to find ways to do that for every character, which is quite a job. Like, that's quite a workload when you have, like, 5 or 7 pretty significant characters in the book. And it's a pretty short book. Like, it's doing a lot of work at once. I was wondering if you were aware, and if you had to think about, how do I reveal each character's culture and values in order for readers to be able to understand them? Like, did you think about how well you were doing that as you went, and, like, face challenges doing that through revisions, or did that just sort of come naturally?
Wow, nothing comes naturally. It's all so terribly hard. I think for Natalie, I mean, because the book is told in first person from Mira's point of view and the captain's point of view, and then sometimes we get stories that, like, Mira will say, the captain told me something, but it's not a scene that we've seen. And so I wanted to play with the things that were going on behind the scenes too in this book. But for someone like, for Mira, she's away and gone. And so I just read Mavis Gallant's novel, Green Water, Green Sky, I think it's called. And there's a line in there about they met every 2 or 3 summers, and each time they were a different person. And so each time Mira comes back, she's like, oh, here's this world that's been going on without me, but look at all the things that have changed. And so it's almost like she's learning about Natalie, and there's things that she doesn't know about her. And so each time I kind of wanted it to come through like, oh, I guess, Natalie now won't sit at a table with someone eating meat, but she has these specific ideas of where they'll go and what's too touristy and what's too trendy, what's not trendy enough. And so, like, I was kind of wanting those things to be coming out almost as Nathalie's kind of she's asserting a self, I think, through the whole book. And I was also thinking a lot about consequence and the way so often I feel that, I mean, not to gender it too much, but that especially in certain settings, that men can live in or have been able to live in a world without consequence in many different venues that we've seen. And again, a lot of people live without consequences, but I wanted the captain to be actually trying to do something that he saw as noble, and is kind of, he reveals it kind of later in the book, but he's suffering the consequences from a lot of things. Whereas I wanted Natalie to be kind of finally now toward the end of her life doing things that are she shouldn't be doing, or she's taking things and she's deciding that she has a right to steal things pajamas because it's an American company and they shouldn't be here, and global capitalism is ruining the world. And so she's like asserting these different things that she's not getting caught for. But of course, she's not doing well in other ways, and so the world is, literally eating at her, I think, in different ways. So, yeah.
I love that. I love that description. This reminds me of a question that I wanted to ask, which is, and I'm kind of jumping around through my questions, so forgive me if we don't follow
That's wonderful. I'm so bad with linearity,
Yeah, it's good because this book is all about conversations in so many ways, and they jump around too. But one of the things that I enjoyed so much about this book is the way that it captures middle life and later life. There is a romance at the core of this book between Mira and the captain. It's a sort of slow boil, fairly subtle romance, but so many of it's like so many books that take on romance or take on like an adventure in another country, or even these political themes, like they often grapple with or present younger characters. And I loved the way that it captures middle life as still being a locus of discovery and big change and adventure and romance. It's not just like people get settled and then they live out the rest of their lives. Everybody in this book is unsettled, and even the couples who are long-standing couples are drifting and separating and coming back together in the ways that young couples so often do. And so I was just curious, and actually there's like a great quote about this that I wanted to, hopefully I can find it. Maybe not. In any case, oh, here we go.
Okay.
Yeah. There's this line where Mira says, "We have become the age of our parents, the pain of our youth crystallizing into something hard and physical, bodily." I was wondering, like, how much you were thinking about capturing that period of life, and also whether you had ideas about capturing it in a certain way. Because in some ways, Natalie, the older that she gets, the more free she seems to get. Yeah. And even the captain's father also goes missing for long periods of time, and like they have these independent drifting sort of adventures that they're on, and they don't care who's missing them or who's worried about them. They're just not answering. They're just not interested in that. And to me that feels, I don't know if that's something that feels more Greek to you, but as an American I was like, oh, these older characters in particular feel especially exciting and adventurous and changing to me in a way that we don't often depict or see depicted older people in American culture.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the older I get, I think I'm just more interested in middle age as a thing. And like, what do we group even middle age into? It's like a big swath, many years from the time, I don't know, someone is 40 till they're, 70, or I mean, what do we say middle age is? And so, and then some of the characters are older, and actually, I don't maybe middle age starts earlier, I don't know, but I was thinking about, it's also kind of a middle space, like it's a transitional space in many ways, where a lot of things happen. It's when people, for women, I think in particular, the choice to have a child or not. By the time a woman is, say, 40, people start commenting, whether, there's still time, but people will start commenting just bluntly, like about, there's a scene where Mira, the people keep telling her, don't wait too long. She's like, oh, thanks, I didn't realize, that. And so like this idea that women's bodies are just up for discussion. And I think Natalie, who's nearing 70, say, I don't think I give her age in the book, but that's kind of how I saw her, is also saying, I have a body, I'm still in a body, and people might not want to see the body. We want to see, 25-year-olds everywhere, but she's asserting herself in different ways through her art, even through social media, this idea that she still exists. And I wanted it to be kind of like the assertion of, these bodies, and the way also politics acts on a body, and how that can, she has a line where she's saying like everything's written on the body, and the way place and politics act on that. But I think I'm just, my imagination is just most interested in the period of middle age, because I'm middle-aged, but because also I just find it, I don't know, it's often ignored, I think, in the coming of age narrative is always a narrative of someone, maybe first sexual experience or first romantic experience, and I don't even know if I like the term coming of age, because what does it mean to be of age? But I think that we have these moments of growth, all through our lives. I mean, I hope, right? And so that's what I was thinking about.
I know. I think that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book, because it makes, I think so often our narratives of getting older feel like they're narrowing. Like you have your big adventures when you're young, and then your life just settles and narrows down into this one very predictable thing. And to have that cracked open and kind of, or even exploded, so that these characters' lives in many ways feel like they're getting more interesting the older they get. That's, another element of the book that makes it fun to live in for a while. You're like, okay, there's still hope for me. um, but okay, I want to talk a little bit more about the book's structure, because obviously this is like one of its most striking features. And it's relatively uncommon for a book to have multiple first-person narrators. And a lot of, I think, editors and advisors might, sort of say, oh, are you sure you want to do that?
Right. Who's writing this book? Like,
writing this book, who's the core, who's the anchor, who's the consciousness that we're following? I can see, I think it was beautifully done, and I can see so many like interesting thematic reasons why this feels like the right structure for this book. But I'm wondering whether you ever doubted it, or faced pushback, or tried it, or thought about how it would be with only one point of view, and how you came to the decision to keep both, and whether that had certain challenges that you had to overcome.
Yeah, I still, if I overthink like who is telling the story and in what form, like how are they both narrating this book, right? But then when I started going with this idea of they're both telling their stories and they're both narrating it, and is the captain's voice coming through Mira, or is it coming through his own storytelling? But when I started thinking about balconies and eavesdropping, and imagining these stories kind of just going out into the courtyard, even though they're both referencing, each other, I thought I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna think about this as a call and response. Both they're talking, and even I tried to play with toward the end of the book that you can't always. I wanted it to feel strange that you can't always tell if she's talking to him or talking to us. Like letting the quotes kind of drop away, or how much is she telling the captain and how much is she telling to us, the reader or the implied audience. And so I was thinking about that, and I was really taken with, I love stories that have an invoked listener, like a you. And I started that way with, there was they were both talking to a you, and that you was unclear. And then it started to feel like gimmicky, or not gimmicky, but everything's a gimmick, I guess, but like there was almost it was too obvious or something, or it felt a little stunted somehow. And so I let that fall away. But I think in the beginning, they were both talking to each other. And then I just kind of went with that. But I always liked third person better. And I was always kind of thought myself more interested in kind of third person realism. And with each project I do, I move further and further away from that. And I'm more interested in how we tell stories, why we tell stories, like the being, knowing, becoming of writing and of narration. And I kind of wanted to go with that, like what the narrative strategy here is, sort of mimicking the actual structure of the book. And it's sometimes the things that I like most in the book are always something that's like its weakness. It's like, if you think about it too much, you start to think, well, how are they both telling these stories? Like, why are there two first person narrators within the book, but.
And did you ever have any early readers or editors who didn't want that style of narration, or was it never a problem?
No one ever commented on the two first person. Yeah, I think there were some problems with, in early drafts, problems of balance, and I think I was trying to give them both narrators equal time. And it turns out that Mira Mira kind of anchored the story in some way, and then the captain is kind of secondary in some way. He's an important character, but Mira gets more time telling the story. And a lot of his story, I think, she tells also. And so I was thinking about who tells people's stories, what parts of people's stories. There's a character his name's Rami, and he's a refugee from Syria, and he's living with her good friends because their fathers were good friends in university, and that's kind of the backstory. And I didn't want to tell, he's living in Athens. He's, being homeschooled there. He's got friends there. He's, playing video games with his pals. And the daughter of her friends, Lila, is they pal around together all over Athens. And I wanted it to be like, even though he was trying to get to Germany, where his brother was with an aunt, he had a life there. And I didn't want to tell the story of his trauma, but I did want to acknowledge that they're, I don't want to reduce the character to their traumas, but I also don't want to act like those traumas don't exist. And so that was something I was also balancing, but deciding to let Rami just be a character that he has his own liminality there, but also Athens to him is going to be an important part of his coming of age, whether, even if he doesn't go back there, or if he, whatever happens after Athens.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite characters, and I love the whole passage later in the book when we get the description of his graphic novel that he has drawn. It's so beautiful, and I really enjoyed your depiction of art, like Nefeli's art and Rami's art. I was wondering how hard that was to do, or how fun that was to do, because I don't know, I think probably 80% of the world fantasizes about being an artist, and you get these ideas of an artwork that you'd like to make, but you don't have the technical skill to do it, or I don't. And so it's, I was just grinning from ear to ear when I was reading especially your descriptions of Nefeli's art exhibit, which is so fascinating. And I know there's notes in the back of the book about an art exhibit that sort of inspired it, but when I researched that, it seemed different enough that I think you're still inventing a lot. And I was just wondering how hard it was for you to both kind of conceptualize what kind of art these artists would be making, and then also put it into words so that it became so vivid and real to us.
Oh, it was terrible. I mean, for me, visual stuff is so there'll be a bright pink van parked outside the house for a week, and my husband will say, whose van is that? What van? I just don't notice things. And so in an early draft, I had a friend read the draft, and she said, we don't really see any of the art that you're talking about, because I'm talking about it philosophically or whatever. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just not very good at visual description. And she said, yeah, but you put the art in the book, you made that choice. It didn't just show up there. I was like, oh yeah, okay. So there was, I had to really sit and think about it. It's really hard for me to sit and describe something, but then once I get into it, I really enjoy it. But I don't have my instinct is not for the patience of thinking about what something looks like. I can think about what it means or what I want it to represent, but for me, the visual descriptions were just really, they don't come easily for me. And I think what is an exercise I often give my students is just to describe a space, and I think I make students do that so often is because I'm not good at it. It's not an instinct for me. It's just what things look like.
Well, you did it really well, I have to say. I can still totally see both of those artworks, and I loved I agree with you that that's how well you convey Rami's story is through his own art, so that he has agency in telling about his trauma. And then, well, I don't want to give away too much. We can talk privately later about great things about Nefeli's art exhibit that I just loved. So I have maybe one more question. I have time for maybe one more question before we should probably open this up to other people's questions. And I'm trying to decide which of my remaining questions I should boil it down to. But I guess I'm really curious if you would talk, I know this is kind of a lame generic question, but in this case, I'm genuinely curious how you settled on the title Scorpionfish, because scorpions play a recurring role in the book. And of course, there is something significant about the scorpionfish that I don't want to give away to the audience right now, but it's so briefly kind of included that I think this question can still be answered without spoiling things for the book. But could you talk a little bit about how you decided on this title? I mean, scorpionfish, I know what they are, and it's a beautiful, interesting creature, dangerous creature, poisonous. But also it feels like a hybrid word, scorpion and fish, and you remind us of that by putting so many scorpions in Nefeli's artwork. So I'm just wondering about hybridity and your choice of that title, and whether there were other titles along the way.
Oh, there were so many titles, none of them very good. But
great title. Not I mean no critique at all. I'm fascinated, and it's super memorable. It's a great title.
Oh, thank you, Valerie. I really like the title because I didn't come up with it. My editor came up with it, and what Maisie Cochran at Tin House, and when she said it, I was like, yes, that's perfect. That's the perfect title. I don't know what it means to be a perfect title, but for me, that's finally it grabbed something that I was thinking about. There's Nefeli's work uses a lot of scorpions. There's, scorpionfish are, if they sting you when you're swimming in the Aegean, it hurts. But they're also really tasty fish, and you find them on, people fish for them and you find them on the menu a lot. And so I was thinking about that kind of duality, but also just the idea of these, a scorpionfish is a thing, but merged as one word. I really like the way that that's kind of pushed together like that. Yeah, and I think so much of the book, it's set in Athens, but it's also set on an island, and the sea, the Aegean in particular, plays such a huge role in many different ways. One is a place for going on holiday for the weekend, or going to your family house, or tourists going to all the Greek islands for summer or whatever, but also a place of crossing that's more fraught for migrants and refugees and people just looking for a better life or needing to leave. And so I was thinking about that kind of, the way you look at something depends on how you've experienced it, and no place is neutral without, associations.
That's great. Would you be willing to share any of the other titles that you had before this one? I think this is a great title. I'm curious, like the ones that you decided against, what were they?
The one that an earlier one was Sinners and Thieves, because that's how people read the street that she lives on, a street called Warriors and Thieves, but the word for warrior and sinners in Greek is very close, and people will hear the other because sinners is more, more exciting. And so that was one of the titles, but I think it had it had a kind of religious undertone that I didn't necessarily think fits the book. But that was one. And then before that, it was Invisible City, after Calvino's Invisible Cities, and that was an earlier draft, but somehow Scorpionfish just kind of stuck for me. But I love titles, but I love titling other people's works, but for my own, it's so hard. I find it so hard.
I think the best titles are the ones that come as gifts from other people. Those
yes.
are the ones that I'm most like, because you feel no shame about them. You're like, yeah, somebody else named it and it's perfect.
Yeah, I like it. Somebody else named it.
It's right. Yeah. I remember when Elena Del Banco found the title for Nancy Reisman's book, First Desire.
Oh, that's such a great title, and such a beautiful novel too.
Yeah, when titles come about from conversations among writers and editors or whatever, I think that's because it feels like there's this element of collaboration also, which is so rare among writers. I mean, not exactly rare, but it's like it's not a conventional part of the writing process the way it is for musicians to say, right?
Right. And people are so brutally honest. Like if I gave someone a story, they wouldn't be like, this is terrible, right? But if you say, here's some titles I have for the book that I'm thinking about, they're like, oh God, no, that's horrible. And so opinionated, so fast. It's so funny. Like you haven't even read the book yet. You don't like the title, but like, so the idea of titling, I think it's really fun to talk about them with other people because people have such strong opinions about titles. And, do you want a title that's a sentence or one word or a gerund or whatever? Like there's certain things people like in titles.
Yeah, and how a title can, it performs like so many different functions. Like on the one hand, it's the thing that makes somebody curious, right? Makes somebody pull it off the shelf and say, ooh, I want to read that. But on the other hand, it also like shapes our sense of what the book is about, what we're supposed to look out for in the book. And then also if it performs those functions, it should then the third, I think, good function that a good title can perform is like that it's memorable. That's such a dumb one, but like sometimes I'm not sure, okay, there's 45 people in the room. I'm not sure if I should say this because everybody keep this secret. But like one of my favorite authors from recent years is Garth Greenwell. I think he's brilliant. And every time I try to recommend his first book, which is called What Belongs to You, I cannot remember that title. It's just, to me, it feels really kind of like it could apply to so many different books, And so just like there are titles like that like might fulfill the first two functions, but if they're not also somehow don't have the capacity to stick in your head, then I also just feel like it's not quite doing it. But I feel like Scorpionfish, like it just does all of that. I've belabored this question. I'm sorry, everyone.
I love titles. It's good.
I think at this point, if anybody has questions from the audience, we would love to, you can type them into the chat or you can raise your hand. Daniel, go for it.
I'm going to throw it in. I love your portrayal of Athens in the book. It's almost like a character in the story. It's so vibrant. It's so different than what I expected. It's beautiful, but it's also dirty and it's like timeless and then so contemporary. tell me a little about and I know that you visit Athens a lot, like what you wanted people to get out of Athens from the story.
I think that's a great question, Daniel. Thank you. I think Athens has been, especially in the past 5-10 years, so portrayed at the heart of, the global financial crisis in certain ways. I mean, we've got like the dancing Zorba the Greek kind of image, or we have like the lazy Greeks just sitting around in the cafes while the hardworking Germans are, running, doing all the work. And there's always these kind of, every stereotype is, a single story that is harmful and damaging. And I wanted to show it as it's a vibrant city, a multicultural city. It used to be quite a kind of homogenous city, and it's quite becoming quite multicultural. And just kind of Athens, I think, is my favorite city in the world. And in some ways it was a love letter to Athens in many ways. But I wanted to kind of capture the daily life, at least from these characters' point of view. I don't want to assume all daily life is like that, but characters who are sort of, because they're in between stations, have a lot of time to go out and walk around and see the city, because the kind of, I don't know, psychogeography or mythogeography of Athens is just really interesting to me, in the way you can just kind of have a fluid experience of walking from one end of it to the other. And I've always really liked that. There's also the kind of, if you travel as a tourist to Athens, there's the really kind of touristy places. And often the kind of touristy places are the ones that are called authentic. What does that mean for a place to be authentic? Where often people say, no, let's go to a real Greek place, when there's like a really great restaurant that's a little bit more, as if like, if you live like an Athenian experience has to be like kind of an old, worn down cafe that the decor hasn't been changed in 30 years, like that's more authentic. And somehow we can't have like a kind of foodie experience in a place like Athens. And so I was thinking about those things too. But then also how the crisis tourism and certain kinds of tourism overly cater to things, putting signs out that say locally sourced and, Greek products, when that's how most Greek restaurants have been anyway, before, being catered to being neighborhoods that normally didn't have tourism now are kind of opening up to tourism, that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm rambling a little bit on that one, but yeah.
Not at all. No, it totally made me want to go to Greece. I haven't been to Greece yet. And I was like, the whole time I was reading the book, I was like, Rodney, we have to go to Greece. We have to go to Greece. He's like,
when can we travel again?
I know, that's what he said. He said, can't go right now. This is from one of my grad students, Molly, who says, Natalie, you mentioned earlier drafts and your trusted readers who helped you shape it. What's your approach in your revision of a project as big as a novel, especially one that balances multiple characters' voices? Do you get a lot of the uncertainty out as you plan and draft, or does your process involve a lot of rewriting from scratch, etc.?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I must have done, I lost, after about draft 35, I stopped counting because it just becomes so depressing. Like, I'm writing this again. I mean, sometimes I do open up a blank page in Word and write something over, or especially when I knew I needed scenes that were not there, I would just, it felt confining to put it in the actual document. I mean, this is really technical, but I couldn't seem to think inside the story that was already there. So I'd have to kind of write things either by hand in a notebook or in their own file and think about, how that was fitting in. But I cannot write in a linear way. I cannot, when someone sits down, like I think Zadie Smith writes a story line by line, beautiful sentence by beautiful sentence, and she writes each sentence until she's done, and then that's it. Whereas I start in the middle and I go back to the beginning, and the beginning ended up at the end. There's a scene in the book where Mira goes swimming, and that was one of the first scenes in the novel, and now it's one of the last scenes. And so I have no sense of linearity or when I'm working. And so a lot of the process, the revision, is actually when I start to actually see the book, like say by draft 6 or 7 or 8, and then I almost started over. But I've started this book over many times before I kind of found the voices that I wanted.
That's great. I see another question from Christy Clancy, who says, wonderful author also of a beautiful new novel called The Second Home, which if you guys haven't read it, I highly recommend it. She's awesome. One of our graduates. Hi, Christy. She says, what was it like to write in first person? Do you think you'll change the voice in your next project? And also, I should add, like, what was it like to write in first person with 2 different characters? Because it's one thing to find the voice for one character and sustain that in a consistent, compelling way. But you had to do that with 2 different characters here. So bonus question.
I think I started first person because I was so afraid of first person and I wanted to try to see if I liked it. And now I can't imagine third person. It feels like there's such a, unless it's a told narrative where I'm aware of the narrator that's telling the story in third person, is kind of where I think I'm going with the next project. But once I started thinking about first person and a narrative strategy and the idea that I read that book by Christopher Castellani called The Art of Perspective, which is so fantastic. It's such a beautiful little craft book about, and he talks about the idea that the narrator is inextricable from the story, that the way the story is being told is the story itself. And then I thought, oh, I have to write this all in first person. And so I kind of have become enamored of the kind of psychological, the experience of being in a certain consciousness that is telling its own story. So I think the next time I think the next project is also in first person, but we'll see what happens with that.
I think we have one last question for now from Lindsay Nays, who says, how different would you say the final draft of the novel is from the first draft?
I think there's some things that are the same, like the kind of essence sort of still remains, but it's completely different. I mean, there's probably 150, 200 pages that just were cut out. And yeah, the first draft, the final draft is a completely different book in many ways. It's concerns, it's preoccupations. Well, some of them it's conceit, it's just even like the sequence of events and things like that. Yeah, so very different.
Did you always, can I just ask one last question? Did you always sense that it would be about this length? Because sometimes I feel like, I don't know, somehow for me, like the length of a book I start to feel like, oh, this one's going to be maybe 280 pages, or this one's going to be 500. Like you have a sense of like how big the story is. Did you get that sense? And if so, like how far into the project did you know how long it should be?
I don't know when I figured that out. I knew that I had written too much and there was a lot that needed to come out. I mean, I've cut characters, I collapsed characters into each other, that kind of thing. But I've been really kind of taken by shorter novels recently. And at the same time, I say that I also love the Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, which is a saga, like 1,000-page novel, if you count all four of them. And so, but I think I wanted to write something shorter and a little bit more muscly, I think. And so 250, that's short it's a short-ish novel, I think, this one. Mm-hmm. But my tendency is to write a lot more than I need, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I love really long novels too, so. Yeah.
My last question, Natalie, for you, and then we can wrap this up if you guys don't have further questions, is what books have you been reading in the past? What books have like blown your mind in the past, say 2 years or so, or like right now, books that like you've read or they could just be books that were especially important to the crafting of this book. But like, if people enjoyed the kind of things you talked about, or just who are writers and books that have shaped your writing style, or you're just totally thrilled you, even if they're different from what you do.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Ferrante was a major influence as I was writing these books. I was reading her a lot. Jasmine Ward's Sing Unburied Sing, I think, is just such a phenomenal book, and it just stayed with me, and I still think about it. And that was one. I just read recently Mieko Kawakami, Breasts and Eggs, and I wish I had it right here. It's kind of too far on myself, but it's a wonderful book, Breasts and Eggs. It came out with Europa maybe 6 months ago. Let's see, I've got a stack here. I'm reading this now, Strange Weather in Tokyo. I'll put it right up to the camera. And then this is a collection called This Way Back. It's a friend of mine, Joanna Eleftheriou. It's a collection of essays about growing up in Cyprus and also in the US, kind of back and forth. She's a beautiful, beautiful writer. And I've just also started this Alice Randall, Black Bottom Saints, set in Detroit. And I've just started it, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it looks like it's going to be great. So we'll stop there. I could probably keep going, but.
That's great. I love it. I love it. And anybody who hasn't seen Natalie's book in person, I think you have because you signed up. But this is what the beautiful cover is. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. And I'm so delighted that you guys all could join us tonight. If there are no further questions, we are like perfectly at an hour, and I like to be timely. So Daniel, is there anything else we should do or say?
I think we should thank everybody for coming.
Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see your faces too, even, and your names there. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, especially to my students and former students and all my friends from afar. I'm delighted to see you. And Susan, it's so nice to see you, Susan Fear, and just everybody. I'm so happy to see you all. Thank you for coming. I love this book. I can't recommend it enough. And if you know me very well, you know that I really don't recommend books that I don't love. I'm not like a, like a voracious reader. There are a lot of books I don't like, and I really love this book. So thank you for writing it, Natalie.
Thank you, Valerie, for talking with me. And thank you, Daniel, for having me again.
It's a pleasure. And thanks to all of you for coming. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you, bookstore virtual or otherwise.
How many days, Daniel? You didn't say how many days Boswell's been open.
4,190. I think I got that. I wrote it down, and then I just.
Those of you who don't know, usually at Boswell, they start every event by telling us how many days the bookstore has been open, because they opened in the middle of the economic crisis in like 2008 or 2009.
Yeah.
So it's such a great countdown. And please don't stop doing it.
From crisis to crisis, but fortunately, we're weathering this crisis thanks to all of you. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.